Within this SEA, it was decided to complement this SEA, which already dealt with climate change aspects, but maybe not in the expected systematic way. So it was decided to complement this SEA with the climate proofing for development tool. This climate proofing for development tool consists mainly of 4 steps. The first one is gathering all the climate change relevant information and defining the exposure units. The exposure units are the elements of planning affected by climate change that may be productive sectors like agriculture, but also geographic areas or even policy plans, etc. And then second step of the analysis, there has to be identified which biophysical and what will be the biophysical and socio-economic effects of the climate trends on the identified exposure units. On a third step, you develop and prioritize adaptation measures. And then on a last step, you integrate this developed options into the plan. We have on the left side, we have the 4 basic steps, which I come through just explained. On the second column, we have some minor stages. For example, concerning the second step analysis of climate change effects relevant for the project, there is the definition of the climate stimuli, the identification of exposure units, and the determination of biophysical and socio-economic effects. And concerning the development of adaptation options, you have to, one of the minor steps and important steps is to define the links to the project. That means you have to see why the effects are relevant to the planning. There are different criteria to identify if there's an important or relevant link to the project. For example, the probability of occurrence of the climate stimuli. Also the link to the objectives of the plan. I will come now and explain this with an example, what I'm saying now. The link to the objectives of the plan, and also the ability of the group of some population sectors or stakeholders to adapt to climate change. Concerning the formulation of adaptation options, you have to prioritize formulated options. There are also different criteria to make a hierarchization. For example, the urgency to act, the cost of the adaptation measure, the political or social acceptance of measure, and other things like side effects. For example, if the identified measure supports or is consistent with other programs or objectives. So when we have done this, these 4 steps and these minor steps, how would this look like? This is one adaptation table, which on the left side the climatic trends. And for an adaptation table for the PNIP, which was done, I have just taken some of examples. On the left hand, you have the most important identified climatic trends, which are increase of temperature, decrease of precipitation, and accentuation of meteorological extremes. Not very much surprising. Here I took 2 exposure units. There are more exposure units. This is only an example from the PNIP. One exposure unit, for example, is to irrigate agriculture. And the one biophysical effect which the climatic trend may have on this exposure unit, for example, may be to change the agricultural cycle. For example, this can bring a decrease of harvest. And the decrease of harvest has as a socio-economic effect, for example, the decrease of incomes of farmers, and of course it can bring food insecurity. So how can you? What's the relevance for planning of this effects on this identified exposure unit? First, there was identified there's a high probability of occurrence of this effects on the exposure unit, and these are directly linked to the objectives of the PNIP. As stated, one of the objectives of PNIP is food security, and the other is poverty mitigation. So there's a direct link, and there's a high probability of occurrence. So there's a need for action. So you have to develop adaptation measures, which you will prioritize. In this case, for example, some adaptation measures were measures concerning water usage efficiency or promotion of seeds and technologies adapted to new environmental conditions, etc., etc. I won't explain the other one, but the same you can do with the exposure unit livestock. When you see what are the effects, which is the relevance. For example, the relevance for action concerning livestock were middle. The relevance, the need for action concerning the exposure unit irrigated agriculture were high. Where can you? Where's the congruence between the SCA and the climate proving for development? If I go back to the stages of the SCA, well, mainly at the definition of challenges, the definition of exposure units are equivalent to sub-challenges, other environmental challenges, you can say, and you also on the stage 3 and 4, you have to analyze the effects on the exposure unit. And in another step, also in congruence to the SCA, you have to adapt. You have to identify measures, which you will integrate then into the plan, onto the management plan. So there's a quite big congruence between the most important steps of the climate proving for development and the basic steps of SCA. The results of the SCA, of course, were identification of and the climate proving for development were identifications of measures for mitigation of environmental risks and climate change adaptation. There, a management plan was drafted with specific measures to be implemented. It also supported this multi-stakeholder projects. That was not only a side effect, but a good aspect of this SCA. And also the Malian government is quite convinced about the utility of the tool capacity proving for development. It, as I have said, it had also implemented in other sectors, also at local level, not only concerning the SCA of the PNIP. And it has a big interest to mainstream climate change aspects in other programs and plans of the government. What are the lessons learned concerning the integration? And that's my last slide, and I'm finishing concerning the lessons learned integrating climate proofing for development into the SCA. Well, both instruments are quite flexible, so it's a thing you can easily do. It was also a good thing maybe concerning the debate of having new tools, new assessment tools or not, that climate proofing for development completed the SCA, so the entry point was through the SCA, which probably facilitated the whole process. It's important that these complementary tools are integrated early into the planning process and should be implemented during the whole planning process as part of the SCA. And in this sense, also the determination of exposure units and the definition of SCA challenge should be synchronized. And participation, of course, as in an SCA is a really important thing. Okay. Well, these are the partners who included in this whole process. If you want to have more information, you can ask me or my colleague Alexandra Freude, who works mainly on this climate proving for development, and of course also Michel Bouchard, as I said. Thank you very much for your attention.